So today we welcome Louise Matson, who's Executive Director of the Division of Indian Work. They have or are celebrating their 70th anniversary this year. And you may have seen an article about them in MinnPost on September 23rd. And if you haven't seen it, it might be worth looking up and hearing about that. Louise founded and operated the first Boys and Girls Club located in a school in Minneapolis. She was a founding board member of Bedote Learning Center, a Dakota and Ojibwa immersion school located in South Minneapolis. And this morning, as I said, she will be speaking about investments in urban Indian well-being. Before we get started, just some logistics. For those attending in person, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. I know it seems like you ought to be able to hear each other, but we want the people online to hear as well, so we want to use that microphone. And for those attending on live stream, please submit your comments or questions in the live stream chat, and we'll monitor that and raise your questions or comments on your behalf. So, with that, please join me in welcoming Louise Matson.
Bonjour, good morning. Louise Matson, Indigenous Makwa and Dudem, Gawa Baba Kinikag and Dunjaba. My name is Louise Matson, and I'm Bear Clan from the White Earth Nation. I'm the Executive Director at the Division of Indian Work. Been there about 20 years. I came there as a teacher to run the Youth Leadership Development Program. So I'm also an urban Native person. I've lived in South Minneapolis most of my life. I've never lived on my reservation. Also multiracial. My mom is Norwegian, and my dad is the White Earth enrollee. So I'd like to put myself in context because that's my area of expertise. That's my experience. And I also say that because I'm very typical for an urban Native person. We're very multiracial. We're very multi-tribal. And I will talk about that more later when we talk about urban folks. But I'd like to talk about some language terminology that I kind of want to get on the radar right away. So we all know that Columbus got it wrong, and we're not Indians. He didn't land in India, or we all know that the correct terminology is Native American, or what we're urged to say. But yet, here I am from Division of Indian Work, and you'll see Indian used a lot. And the main reason for that is it is a federal government term. It's in a lot of my grants and contracts. A lot of us we've been around a while, 70 years. That was the terminology, and we still use it in a lot of our tribal nations because it's in our constitutions. So the federal government had a hand in writing all of the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe constitutions in Minnesota, and so that's in there. So we use it also out of convenience and habit. So sometimes it's confusing when you go to a speech or someone goes back and forth, like you'll probably hear me do it, saying either Anishinaabe, Indian, Native. I really think that you can't go wrong using Native American if you don't know. But it's really good if you can, when you're talking to Native people, is what is their tribal nation, their tribal affiliation. And they'll tell you, like I did, even though I've never lived there, I probably won't ever live there, but that's putting you in context of where my family's from. And I compare it to being in a small town or growing up in a small town where you introduce yourself and then you might find you have people in common or relatives. And I've done that. I was at a training once and introduced myself, and through talking in this training, I realized that my cousin was there, a little girl I had never met before. So it's a small world, and so I kind of compare it to that. So you can't go wrong, though, saying Native American if you're not sure. But if you're meeting with tribal people, ask them where they're from, and then that's how they self-reference. So also, it's confusing, too, here in Minnesota. You hear different terms. So when you hear Chippewa, Ojibwe, and you heard me say Anishinaabe, I'm referring to the same group of people. So this Chippewa is a mispronunciation of Ojibwe. And Anishinaabe is what we call ourselves in our language. So Anishinaabe means like the people. So you might hear other people say it like Anishinaabe Academy. Those are Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Chippewa language words. So same group of people. So, and you can kind of hear that if you say Ojibwe, and then you say Ochippewa, Ojibwe, you can hear. So we didn't have written language for a long time, so a lot of stuff was, heard by perhaps, settlers or folks coming in, and they wrote what they heard. Also, you'll hear a Dakota, and there's Lakota people, there's even Nakota people. They're commonly referred to as Sioux. Same group of people. But Sioux is falling out of favor a little bit as people learn that Sioux could be short for an Anishinaabe word for snake. And we'll talk about why that would be. So a lot of people don't use that term anymore. We are in Dakota homeland. Most people will use Dakota. But I would never tell like the Mystic Lake tribe to stop using Sioux. That's their right, how they are going to be referenced. But as we learn more and we understand history and there's language revitalization, people are more likely to use Dakota. Some of the younger staff that I work with will even say they're indigenous. So it gets a little confusing, but you can also see that happening. The Navajo people in their language are Dene people. The Ho-Chunk people in Wisconsin were referred to for quite a while as Winnebago. I don't know if people remember that, but that was based on, I think, what the Anishinaabe people were calling them, and people heard it and called them Winnebagos, when in their language, and they're Ho-Chunks. So as we talk about language revitalization, understanding history, we use more of the real, I would say the real names, the language names for our people. And raise your hand and ask questions anytime you like. Yes. Well, the question was Division of Indian Work part of the Council of Greater Minneapolis Council of Churches? And yes, we were. So I can touch on that a little bit, because that directly, we're 70 years old and why we started, how we started. But I also like to talk about who are the Native people in Minnesota, just as also an understanding, kind of a little background, and it leads directly into then who are the urban Native people in Minnesota. So we are on Dakota homeland. So this is the place where the Dakota people have their origin story. So that is in our name, Minnesota. Minne is water, and Sota or Shota is like the cloud on the water or the fog on the water, depending on how you say it. Now, I'm not a language expert. I don't know a lot of my own language because of my urban upbringing and my separation from my culture on that side. But the largest group of Native people here in tribal nations are Anishinaabe. So Anishinaabe, there's seven reservations in Minnesota. At the forefront of like looking at water quality and mining, because that plant is sacred and came here for that reason. So he came here and settled here, and so that's when I mentioned the word Sioux. There was some conflict. In fact, my father also never spent much time on White Earth Reservation. He grew up in a really small town called Warroad, up on the Canadian border, and that's where some battles were in Warroad. So we settled there, and you can see White Earth is the largest Anishinaabe reservation. And reservations were not land that was given to Native people. It was land we managed to retain out of all the land holdings that we had all across Turtle Island, or what we refer to as North America. Now, Dakota communities are down here in the southern part of Minnesota, and they're much smaller than the Anishinaabe population, and a big part of that reason is the War of 1862. So in 1862 was during the Civil War. There was annuities that were to be made to Dakota people in southern Minnesota, and they were not made, and so they had an uprising. There was a war, and it was brutal on both sides. There's a lot of healing to do on that, but after 6 weeks, the Dakota people were defeated, and they were the largest mass hanging in the United States took place in Mankato, where they hung 38 Dakota men. And then they marched everybody else up to Fort Snelling, where they spent the winter. And there was a lot of suffering, both on the march and in Fort Snelling. And there are some Dakota people that think Fort Snelling, it's a concentration camp and it should be torn down. But there's a memorial at Fort Snelling in the park below for the Dakota people. And people commemorate that every year with marches, and there's a horseback ride. And so also, the people were, Dakota people were forced out of Minnesota. And in 1863, they passed the Dakota Removal Act. That is still on the book, people. Like, I can't believe that. You are not supposed to be in Minnesota if you're Dakota. It's one of those laws that every year or every few years they trot out and say, isn't this weird? We have this weird thing. It's not enforced. I mean, it's pretty insulting, I think, and I don't understand that, but so a lot of the Dakota people went to South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and some never left, and a lot are coming back. So they are the smallest communities as opposed to Anishinaabe people. So it's kind of a rough overview of our state. So we have 11, either it's a reservation or community, and of our tribal people here in Minnesota.
So I just had a brilliant idea. Is that where North Dakota and South Dakota come from?
You know, I don't know. I mean, they had that name before the Dakota people went there, so I would assume that they're named after the Dakota people. So that's kind of our overview. But, however, our urban areas are very, very diverse. So back in 1950s, 1952, when DIW was formed, the government policy, which is one of many, Indian people have had many, many policies, laws, treaties to solve the Indian problem. And this one was move to urban areas. They really recruited people to leave reservations and come to urban areas for jobs, for school, and it's a land grab, let's be honest. You're going to get a little bit of my comments here on understanding what happened, but really leaning toward tribal termination, right? So if we can get the Native people off the land that they managed to retain and go to the urban areas, that was a big part of that push. So they did. A lot of people went to urban areas, and there weren't resources. There weren't the resources and the jobs and the housing that they thought. So in 1952, Greater Minneapolis Council of Churches, it was a different name back then, they formed DIW. And Interfaith Action over in St. Paul formed Department of Indian Work. And then the Council of Churches for Minnesota kind of took on the rest of the state. So we were started as a food shelf, and we're just supposed to be temporary. So over the years, though, GMCC started to hire Native directors, and our programs really grew. Like, we added youth programs in the 80s. It grew so much to the point where we became the largest part of GMCC, and then we decided to separate from GMCC. We were getting a lot of pushback from community about Native leadership and services for Native people being led by Native people. And DIW is majority Native staff. We already had a board that was majority Native, but the 501c3 was with GMCC. So there were some grants we couldn't apply for because they didn't consider us a Native-run agency because the board was not majority Native. So we decided with GMCC and our board to separate. Starting in 2016, it took a couple of years. The 70-year history back then, 5 years ago, is a long history to separate, and things like our beautiful building on Lake Street, who was that built for? So we had a lot of negotiations, and we separated in 2018. And they're across the street, so we still support one another. But I'm proud to say that we are a Native-led and Native-run organization. So to talk about how diverse the urban area is, so my staff probably represents, over the years, 30 different tribal nations. So I have Senecas from New York, Meskwakis from Iowa. I have Googled tribal nations because I didn't recognize where they were from. There's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and we're all different. We have some commonalities, but I was talking to Gretchen. I've known her a long time, but our mutual friend Noya Woodrich was the woman who hired me, and for the longest time she kept talking about her corporation in Alaska. She's Athabascan Native, and I finally said to her, "You're running a business up there? Like, that's got to be so hard here." And she said, "No, that's how her tribe is organized up there. It's a corporation, and she's a shareholder." And I had never heard of that before. So we're very different. So that's why I also gave you my context, because I can't speak for all tribal nations or different practices. I don't know. So that's the beauty of Minneapolis. We're really diverse, but it does make it hard in some ways to do language activities or cultural activities. And Minneapolis Public Schools, I think, has 60 different tribal nations represented. And again, we could be multi-tribal, multi-racial. So we're serving people in the urban areas from all over the United States, actually. So, and how that can be challenging too is, so we have at DIW a doula program, and one of the things that we do is we have indigenous doulas trained to work with moms. But our emphasis is on Anishinaabe and Dakota. But we might have a mom that, like I said, it might be Seneca or Menominee. And so trying to help them understand like their birthing traditions is a challenge for us, and we've got to do some homework and figure out how to help them. So that's the challenge, but the diversity is also the beauty. In Minneapolis too, we have a really thriving and vibrant community of different agencies that I'm really proud to be a part of. There's a Metropolitan Urban Indian Directors Group, and that consists of, there's Minneapolis American Indian Center, there's Indigenous Peoples Task Force, Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. So there's a lot of resources for our people in the Twin Cities. And it's really, we don't often agree, or I shouldn't say that, we don't always agree. Or we might compete for funding, but we really try to support one another, and then our goal in working with the community. So I think prior to COVID, we were seeing a lot of really good things happen in and we call it Indian country. It just means, where activities take place all over. We call it what's going on in Indian country. Like Gretchen mentioned, about 6 years ago, the first Dakota and Anishinaabe immersion school was opened in South Minneapolis, which is really a challenge. The languages are very, very different. And to my knowledge, it's the only immersion school that is 2 indigenous languages. But immersion learning works very well with all kids if you're familiar with it. Like it just really helps students achieve, and it's a game changer for Native American students. The Hawaiians that do immersion learning, they graduate 100% of those children, and 80% of them go on. So we looked at that model to do that in Minneapolis, because we have in Minnesota the lowest graduation rates for American Indian students in the country. So that has got to change. And we were seeing those numbers go up. Minneapolis Public Schools do a lot of different efforts and projects in community they're going up. For example, we have a Native Hero campaign. It stands for Here Every Day, Ready to Learn on Time. And it's basically messaging. We're trying to target people to get good habits and understand the importance of school. A lot of our people do understand, but a lot of our people have had very negative experiences with schools. And we have our whole history of boarding schools and historical trauma and grief and loss that still impact the children that we see today. So we're working on getting the schools to be as welcoming and inclusive to our students as possible. So we're seeing those numbers go up. But then COVID happened. And COVID has impacted our community, I would say, among the worst of all different communities. We've been hit hard. So ironically, we have super high vaccination rates. But we have high death rates because of comorbidity issues like obesity and diabetes. It's really hit our community hard. So, and then remote learning and our community's lack of access to technology or engaging in that way has really impacted us. It's impacted us. I looked at the MPS test scores, and I'm not a big believer in just looking at a test score. It's one snapshot of one student, one day of their life. And across the board, all students suffered during COVID. They all did, like reading scores, everything. But our kids, they lost the most. So we have a lot of work to do. But the good news is, we know what to do. We know what is successful in our community. And so I'm excited that we're getting back to doing things like our Native Hero campaign. We just trained 15 more doulas, so we have almost 30 doulas. And doulas improve birth outcomes. They do for everybody. And it's really important for our community to have Indigenous doulas to help improve our birth outcomes. So, there's that saying, nothing for us without us. So, again, we're really pushing to, my group meets with commissioners at the state level to talk about equity and grant making. When we look at the disparities that our community faces, we're making the push that we should have some priority funding. We also, when they came out with how life expectancy has gone down across for all Americans, I don't know if you saw that in the paper, for Native people, 6 years. We lost 6 years. So, but again, we have programs to work on that. So it's exciting now that COVID's easing up that we can get back into business. Like, we never stopped working with our community. We just shrank so much. Like, we came back after stay home to stay safe, and we opened up our food shelf, but we just delivered groceries out of the garage bay. We did some pop-ups. We did youth groups, but the recommendation was just 10. No more than 10 kids, and then we'd have someone get sick and we'd quarantine for 2 weeks. So it was up and down and up and down. You all lived through it too, and you know what it was like. And so we're rebuilding now. So as people feel safer, we still have COVID, they're coming back to groups. We're going to hire a babysitter again because it wasn't safe for us to do babysitting. That impacted people's ability to come to group, to our young mothers. So all these things like a domino effect. So now we can rebuild and kind of push the programs that we know are successful with our people. We're also pushing in our community. You might have seen or heard of the Urban Indigenous Legacy Initiative. So we combined 16 of us agencies, went into the legislature last year and we asked for $85 million in capital money. So all together, because they have $9 billion. So once in a lifetime opportunity for the state to invest in our agencies. Most of the agencies in Minneapolis they're struggling with their buildings, their operations. Their buildings are old or they were repurposed. I'm very lucky at DIW that our building we're in right now on Lake Street is about 30-some years old, and we've been fundraising to do capital work on it already. So we just had received a huge grant from the Butler Family Foundation, and we did all our HVAC units. They were 30 years old. They were getting red tagged, I think it was. So Yeah, and that was that's a panicky moment when you have a building and your inspector comes in and says, you can't have this furnace on. It's November, it's dangerous, and that heats half the building, And we did a lot of work at DIW. So in that 16 people in that Yulee initiative, we prioritized the projects. So the priorities are Indian Center, Minneapolis American Indian Center on Franklin. They're moving out. They're going ahead. They've been trying to raise money for 5 years, but with COVID and everything's getting more expensive, the bar keeps going up. It keeps going up. And they're building literally, if you go in there, they have buckets when it rains. It's just pouring rain inside. McGizzy Communications, beautiful new green building burned down after George Floyd was murdered. They were right by the 3rd precinct. So we've prioritized them. DIW, we're in the middle because we were in pretty good shape. What we do have is housing right next to DIW that is, I've put on temporary hiatus. It was transitional housing for teen moms. But the house was built in 1909. I started calling it the money pit because it was just falling apart. So it's not a good place for young moms and toddlers to live either. So I would like to tear that building down. So hopefully they'll come and we'll get some money because, again, our services for our community they're needed. But we do need buildings where we can heat it. We have office staff. We have to have a safe building. And most of us, including DIW, we don't charge anything for our services or our work with our relatives, and we never will. So we've got to raise that money in other ways. And that Gen Op money is gold money. I have a lot of contracts, but they're restricted. So I get a small percentage that most contracts are like that you can spend on, like doing your payroll or having your accounts, your accountant. But most of it is directly related to like improving birth outcomes, improving grades, improving attendance, all these measurable outcomes that we have to report back on. So I've been kind of just talking straight up a lot. But I really love being part of the community. And I think for me, I've been able to access a lot of language and cultural practices by working there. And so, most of us in the urban area, we're separated. White Earth is almost 5 hours away from the Minneapolis. And they're beautiful. Our reservations are beautiful. They have high poverty levels because of lack of jobs. Again, I compare it like sometimes when I drive to a small town up north anywhere, I wonder, how do people survive? How do they make a living? It's difficult. So a lot of folks still come to the city for school and for work. And I love to get those native graduates from the U or from Augsburg. I just love these young, they've got energy. Really a lot of language revitalization and ceremony happening in Minneapolis. That's another great thing to get over COVID, to have that. So we just had a cedar ceremony. It's an Anishinaabe ceremony at DIW on Thursday, and we're doing them every month now. There's a big need and people wanting those cultural healing. Really a high demand, but that it's happening, I think it's a great sign. The culture is prevention. And what else is going on? And you could go to language table for Anishinaabe or Dakota language almost, at least once a week, sometimes twice a week at different agencies. So you could just go and have a potluck and speak language with each other. So. Well, I mean, especially for Native people. So when you look at someone like my grandmother, who was in a boarding school, which I didn't even know until her funeral, because she never told me, and I didn't know enough to ask her. I didn't know that we had boarding schools really until I was older, and in fact, a lot of my relatives were sent there. But boarding school era, I can't emphasize how much that devastated our people. Like, if you want to destroy a nation, you bring women to their knees, and how you do that is you take their kids. And they did, and they took babies as young as 5 across state lines. And the intention of boarding schools was really never to educate people the way we think about it. It was to train servants and farmers, and the intention was to never go home. So when people were punished for speaking their language, they lost their language. There were also a lot of physical abuse. There was a lot of sexual abuse, really for generations of people. And when they came home then, there was a lot of shame for being a Native person. So you didn't speak your language to your children. You also wanted to protect them from what happened to you. So language and culture, you can't separate that. And all that is intertwined. And so that huge loss of knowing ceremonies, of participating in rites of passage. Like there's a moon ceremony that people do, some tribal people do, or becoming a woman ceremony they call it. So when women have their first period, there's a whole ceremony a lot of Native people did around that, but they had to stop doing it. And one thing I think a lot of people don't realize either is we didn't have freedom of religion in the Native community until 1978. So you would be punished legally for doing ceremonies. So they didn't go away, they went underground. But a lot was lost, and that's why language revitalization and cultural revitalization is so important. And so when our kids are grounded in who they are, and they go into school and see themselves in the literature and the art and their teachers, then you're telling them they're important. When you celebrate culture and language to be something to be proud of and not to be ashamed of, that's empowering. There's a Dakota social worker who's retired now. His name was Martin Brokenleg. And he was so powerful when he talked. And he said, you know, in America, we are terrible about teaching about culture. We're terrible because, you know, either if you're immigrated here or your family, English was the way to get ahead. So you probably didn't, you know, they wouldn't talk to you in your language, Norwegian or whatever, unless they wanted to talk about something that they didn't want you to know. Because English was the way to survive, or to excel, I guess, to make it. So, and the difference is Native people is literally, language is literally beaten out of them. Language and culture, all intertwined. But he said, Dr. Brokenleg said, but that's not what people want. Like, we all are searching on where we belong and who we are, who are our people, and when we don't have that, we'll seek out something else. And I've heard similar, some of you that might have heard that, that's kind of like gang culture, the attraction to gang culture, belonging to a group, belonging where you're feeling valued. And so he just said it's kind of an American thing. Like many people in this room, I don't know any Norwegian or Icelandic. I know more Anishinaabe. But that's because I have the advantage of working at this place where when we teach the kids Anishinaabe, I learned it too. I have more Anishinaabe than my dad, which shouldn't be the case, but it is. And again, I'm not unusual. So I hope that answers that question. Okay.
Well, I've also read that the alcoholism not only came from the people colonizing and getting Native Americans drunk, but also the despair that people felt from losing their soul in the boarding schools. And I'm wondering what programs are there in the city for people who have alcoholism?
Well, I think I agree with that self-medicating. I don't think Native people are the only people that do that, but I think a lot of alcohol use, or right now opioids, is about self-medicating pain. So, and actually that's a crisis for us right now, is opioid use and heroin use. Is just, we knew it was a problem before COVID. It's a problem for all communities, but it's hitting our community hard. And I think it's a lot of self-medicating and covering up that grief and loss and despair. So we haven't really been paying attention to it because we're just trying to survive COVID, and now we're like, oh, okay, this is an emergency. If you look at a lot of the homeless folks that are living outside, is yes, housing is tough in Minneapolis, but it's also about drug use and being able to use and not have to follow rules in housing. So we're working hard. Like one of that Yulee bill that I mentioned, there's a man named Mike Gozy who does all sorts of housing. Gretchen knows him. and trying to build different kind of recovery programs. So one thing that we need more of, when we don't have enough of, is like culturally based treatment where women can go with their children, so they don't have to be separated from their children. And also we need to address then what happens after people get out of treatment, and that's where a place like DIW comes into, and different programs where you can be with supportive people that aren't using. Because what happens when people get out of treatment, they made all this effort, and they go home, back into the lion's den. It's really hard to stay sober. So we do groups where you can come, and we have a sewing circle, so it's a supportive group for people that want to be sober activities, being with like-minded people. Twin Cities Lacrosse is another great, things where people are really getting their youth involved in activities and adults involved in activities that don't involve drinking or drug use. So there's a lot of opportunities in that way, but we are lacking in treatment options, and that Mike Gozi wants to build a 30-bed treatment center in Minneapolis. So they're hard. They're limited, and some of them are very expensive. So we're trying to, change that, make it affordable, accessible, and then just different options, different in treatment and then after. And one thing I talked about recently with someone from actually Care 11, I was talking about, wow, in Minneapolis right now we have such an opportunity to look at what's going on with all those empty lots. Like, I'm on Lake Street, and after George Floyd was murdered, we lost a lot of buildings. And there's some that have been rebuilt, but there's all these empty lots all over. I'm like, why won't those be nice little tiny home communities where maybe you could have grandparents, because we do have a program at DIW, grandparents raising grandchildren. Wouldn't that be a nice supportive housing area right across the street from DIW, where you could come to the food shelf, and then you could go to your grandparents support group, and your kids could go to the after school program. But they're all over Minneapolis, and I don't know what's going on with that. And we don't do a lot of housing at DIW. We have that transitional housing next door. We also have a foster care home by Roosevelt. But that's all the housing that I do. I want to leave it to Mike Gozi and those experts. It's hard to do. So I know there's different rules, like in Minneapolis, about, zoning rules, but let's be creative. I don't know who even owns some of those lots, but I drive by them every day and think, wow, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to provide housing. Because I will say, right before COVID, the housing that went up on the corner of Chicago and Lake Street, beautiful new housing, and it's called Sophie, south of Phillips. And I looked on it like, oh, look at this. And they're fully furnished units, but they start a studio at $1,300. And I was just like, wow, that's what we're building right in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Minneapolis? Like, great, build that, but what else? And there's nothing else. So, that frustrates me. But I think that's where we work in and try, as that Metropolitan Urban Indian Directors Group, or me. I need to do a better job of getting out there where they're making the decisions, like on the legislative, which is hard for me to do because we're busy doing our programming. But it's important. Oh, there's another question.
When you mentioned your house next to you, the money pit, came to my mind, if you have talked with Habitat for Humanity to help you build a new building right there, and then that would also, for the volunteers, you could have your community come in and work with them to build that house. And then that might also be a solution for some of those empty lots that you're talking about. And by the way, the chairman or executive committee director is going to be speaking here here at the forum, which is, I think it's a week from Wednesday. It's this Tuesday? Anyway, just a side event.
That's great. That's great. Where I'm sitting at that house right now looking at options. So I had someone donate money to get a consultant and kind of looked at those. And we haven't made a decision yet, so it's great to think of that. I hadn't thought of Habitat for Humanity. Right now we're sitting on the house because we're hoping to get that money from the legislature. That And I had a construction firm come out and look at it, and what they did say on the house is, why I think we should tear it down is it has asbestos outside of it, so any kind of renovation would be really expensive. But I can't so I gotta do something about it, but haven't made a decision, or the board hasn't. So the board has voted to just not sell it, and it's there. And so, all those things we have to consider.
I want to put the context first in my question, which is I really want to affirm what I see as the growth of Native spirituality. As you probably know, there's a Dakota Presbytery with churches from Sisseton west. And I was in a partnership with that presbytery for a period of time, and I noticed there was a real generational divide with the folks who would come and visit us in Baltimore. The younger folks were clearly into Native spirituality and not particularly interested in Christianity. And the older generation was concerned about that. Do you see the future, what do you see as the future of Christianity within the Native population?
Well, I think, it's a complicated issue with Christianity because a lot of the boarding schools that I mentioned, they were run by churches. So it's a complicated history. And then, like I mentioned my father earlier, he was raised Catholic. And he doesn't do any cultural practices at all. And even though he works at DIWs, like our handyman, and he just doesn't want to. And 2 blocks from DIW is Church of the Gichita Kateri, which is combines Catholic practices with traditional practices. So I would say I see a lot of that. I see people that do both, and they walk in both worlds in that way. But I've also heard that that's a criticism, or I've heard some elders say you can't do it both. That's not okay, you can't do both. But I know elders that do both. But I do think that all kind of churches are challenged with younger people just not going to church, belonging to churches. And I think it's a challenge across the board as congregations get older, and how do we engage young people. And I personally believe, and because I myself walk in 2 worlds in a lot of ways, that you can do that. And I think just the overall problem is challenging, is just engaging younger people in any kind of institution, and I think a religious institution across the board. And I also think a big part of for the young people is that celebrating cultural traditions. So they're more focused on practicing in that way, going to a sweat lodge ceremony, or like I mentioned, a cedar ceremony, or there's darkroom ceremony, things like that. So that is, I see a lot more interest in that as people recognize the power in that. I don't know if that answers your question. I think, well, if you look at DIW separating from GMCC, I think that's an indication of, we're separating because we're more a cultural institution than a religious institution.
We have a question from the chat. What is the best way to give money to people? We often see people on entrance ramps to freeways. What is the best way? What do you suggest?
Well, I suggest not giving it that way. If you want to, go ahead, but you don't know, if you're fine with not knowing actually how that money, and I've done it too. Like, I usually don't give money that way, but a man approached me, and he was a Native man with 2 little girls and said he needed gas money. I gave him money, and I don't know, I had to do that knowing that, I don't know that he's gonna spend it on that. The best way I think you can do is support, give it to a legitimate, and I don't want to say that those folks are not legitimate. I don't know, but you don't know. Give it to Habitat for Humanity. Give it to the church. Give it to an organization like DIW that has an audit every year, that has a board and a finance committee. Like, I'm responsible for that money and spending it in the way it was intended. And I have to show that every year in my audits. So you can look and see who's a reputable place to give to, whose house is in order, and who has a good reputation. But I know that So I would that's my suggestion, is go through whatever organization speaks to you, give it to an organization that's set up to make sure that they're spending the money the way that they should be.
Okay, two questions. One is, you didn't mention the Salvation Army, which is the one I know about doing what you're talking about. And secondly, Habitat for Humanity, I don't know if I wasn't listening, I didn't get your answer to that. Are you supporting Habitat for Humanity, like this gentleman suggested, coming in and helping you, or are they already doing it, or what?
Yeah, I think right now we're just kind of holding on to the house till we figure out what to do with it. So, I mean, that's a great idea to partner with Habitat for Humanity, but we haven't made any decisions. The board has voted just to hold on to the house, basically because we really have no money to do anything for it right now. So if we could get some funding, that'll change everything, what we want to do. Oh, 5 minutes.
Thank you for speaking to us today. I think it's amazingly difficult for people of European and other non-American ancestry who have come here within the last 200 years to get information about the Anishinaabe and the Dakota here. I'm amazed that as a native, so-called native European Minnesotan, that I seem to be able to get more information about the tribal groups of New Mexico and Arizona. In fact, in Phoenix, they have a phenomenal museum, the Heard Museum, that has a very large amount of information on the attempted assimilation through the boarding schools and many other things. Why does Minnesota not have a comparable museum?
That's a good question. I think we have seen things change, like there's some good permanent exhibits like the Minnesota Historical Society. The Shakopee Nation is just open, well, not just, it feels like it's hard to gauge time in the COVID era. A beautiful new like historical center and museum there. Mille Lacs has one. I will say, I mean, we really have a thriving and vibrant community in Minneapolis. It's kind of invisible. So that's part of the reason we should be getting out and talking about our people and community. And I actually brought a couple books. Now, I think a good way to learn about a lot of history is either through not necessarily a nonfiction book, but through fiction. And so if you haven't gone to Birch Bark Books yet, and I don't work for Louise Erdrich, but I feel like I always say that. It's a bookstore by Kenwood School, and it's focused on Native authors, but it's a beautiful store. So I recommend a lot of reading there, but I brought 3 books to kind of help spread the word. But if you're looking for what's going on in Indian country here in Minneapolis, we have a paper called The Circle. It's also online. And in the back now that we've recovering from COVID is community events that you could go to, that you're invited to go to, both native and non-native. So that would be a good resource for finding out what's going on, because there's stuff going on next Monday is Indigenous Peoples Day. We'll be having a sunrise ceremony at Madema-Casca. There's different events going on, different things that happen, but maybe not getting the word, we're not strong at getting the word out. Because you're right, a lot of people think that Native folks are in the past, or think of us in a historical way, but we're really not. And I was telling Gretchen, as a director, I walk a fine line. I'm trying to get money for our programs. There's a reason, and we need money for our people to help. But I don't want people to have pity for our community. We're strong people, we're resilient, we're here, we're thriving in a lot of ways. There's just a lot of things that need to be rectified. So this book is a good one that I think is funny. It is funny, because Native people have good senses of humor. If you get teased by a Native person, they do it in a good way, but they're comfortable with you. Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask by Anton Truer, a Leech Lake man, and it's actually funny. Like in there, it's like, what's a rezkar, or what's a powwow, and what's language terms. What should you call Native people? It's a little bit older, and then for history, this is an older book too, but it was Minneapolis book. It's a Spirit Car by Diane Wilson. And it's her understanding, you know, she's Swedish and Dakota, and her discovering that side and what happened in the War of 1862. She's since written many books, and her book, The Seed Keeper, that's her first fiction, it won a Minnesota Book Award. And then there's also my favorite, again, I swear I don't work for her, but I really, I relate to Louise Erdrich. We're both Louises. She's German and Anishinaabe, and like I said, I'm Norwegian and Anishinaabe. I go to see her speak whenever I can. So The Night Watchman is fiction based on her grandfather. They tried to terminate her tribe. She's Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe. So like I mentioned, tribal termination can happen. And it's a way for the government to get out of their treaty responsibilities to Native people. This book won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's good. I loved it, and it's got a lot of humor in it. It's got ghosts in it. Marcy Rendon is a local author. She's coming out with her third book in her series of. So we have a lot of really talented artists and authors. There's NACD in the Powwow Grounds on Franklin has a gallery. There's also a gallery in the Indian Center, but they're closing now for renovations for probably 2 years. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Elena.
You have to tell us more about Anton Ryder and saving the Anishinaabe language next time you come back.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's at the forefront of that. He does a lot of work.
Well, thank you, Louise, and thanks for those book recommendations. I'm going to take my camera out and take a picture of a couple of them. Please join me in thanking Louise for all her insights and perspectives that she so generously shared with us. Next Sunday, we're going to welcome Charlotte Kinsley, who is a homeless and highly mobile student support manager for the Minneapolis